race is on, and while Max Verstappen took his inevitable sixth victory in a row, McLaren was the talk of Silverstone, with Lando Norris taking second and only a badly timed safety car costing Oscar Piastri his first F1 podium. So how did McLaren suddenly emerge as Red Bull's nearest challenger, and is it sustainable? I'm Edd Straw, and joining us to answer those questions and more are Scott Mitchell-Malm, Mark Hughes and Josh Suttill. Well, Mark, another British Grand Prix, a predictable winner, but good event as always.
Yeah, great event. Lovely atmosphere as always, and the performances of Lando Norris and in particular, and Alex Albon to an extent, and also Lewis Hamilton just really got the crowd going as well. It always adds to the atmosphere, and it was entertaining race as well. But obviously Max Verstappen won it, but he didn't lead at all, and the order behind him was a bit unusual.
Yeah, there were plenty of stories. It's a bit like the whole season, isn't it? In that there's lots of jostling in the pack behind, but above it all rises Red Bull and Max Verstappen. I guess that's just the thing, isn't it, Scott? We're not going to talk about Max Verstappen and Red Bull in terms of the success much in this podcast again, just because there's not so much to say other than they're great.
No, exactly. And I think we're all now in a position, aren't we, where we kind of have to look past the fact that Max has won or is going to win any given Grand Prix on any given Sunday at the moment. So you look for the storylines elsewhere. We've done it before when Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes were dominating, and I think this Grand Prix was a fantastic example of just how great the season would be if Max Verstappen wasn't in it.
Yeah, it's the brilliance it's the tedium of brilliance. But I think in years to come, people will look back at this and say, wow, to see Verstappen and Red Bull in this moment must have been massively impressive. We should never lose sight of that. And I don't think Josh Suttill, who's joining us again this weekend, is losing sight of that. Did you enjoy appreciating Max Verstappen's performance?
Absolutely, and the fight behind as well. I mean, just brilliant to go into a race, go into a weekend and have no idea who's going to be second and downwards, even if you know who is probably going to win. Having so many different teams in the fight for second is fantastic to see.
I suppose we should say Max Verstappen did at least have a bite of the pit wall in Q1 when he couldn't quite get out, but that's about as bad as it's got for him this season. Just a quick nose change and it was all fine. But Scott, let's talk about McLaren, because second place on merit for Lando Norris and a fourth place that should have been third for Oscar Piastri. Quite some result for McLaren, given only 2 races ago it had just 17 points and was struggling even to get into the top 10. So is this the proof McLaren really is back in the game, as Zak Brown said after the race?
I think it's a big chunk of the proof. I think a more emphatic example might come in a couple of weeks at the Hungaroring. If both McLarens are in sort of P6 to P8 contention there, I think that would be more emphatic proof, because I think for McLaren to really be back in the game, I think they would need to raise the basement. We've seen even last year and this year, the peaks have been there, but it requires specific circumstances and certainly tracks that lend themselves to the car's characteristics. And there was a degree of Austria and now the British Grand Prix favouring McLaren in that sense with the track layouts and some details of the weekends. But it would be ludicrous to pretend that McLaren hasn't made a significant step. And based on what Andrea Stella has been saying this weekend, a slightly bigger step in lap time terms, raw performance terms, than perhaps McLaren were letting themselves believe. So I think it's a decent chunk of the way there. You can't pretend that if they hadn't upgraded the car, they'd have had these results. It's definitely raised the ceiling. That's why we saw such a great performance this weekend, 1 lap and in race pace. But I really want to see that basement come up, because what was it Lando said after qualifying? They're only about 30% solved their core underlying weaknesses.
Yeah, this is the peculiarities, as Daniel Ricciardo struggled with in terms of the way the car behaves. They've had these problems for 4 or 5 seasons underlying, but they're starting to understand them, they think. So maybe next year those will be solved. But Mark, I guess the point about how track specific it is here in Austria have certain commonalities, not identical, but I did ask Andrea Stella after the race if the Hungaroring was kind of the key one, given it's a lower speed track, and that'll kind of define McLaren's window, won't it? Well, this is kind of the top end of where McLaren can be, and maybe Hungaroring will be the bottom end. So we'll see how that slots in that group behind, and whether their basement is more Alpine level again, or kind of hanging on there with that group battling for second.
Yeah, I mean, this is it's a lovely place for them, as was the Red Bull Ring. It got fast-flowing corners, and that's always been, it's in the car's DNA. It's been like that for the last few years. It's when you've got sort of short corners, but like the switch direction, or the slow speed corners that go on too long and allow the balance to change. That's where it struggles. And so this is a nice place for it. And also the way the tyre picture worked this weekend really favoured that car's ability to switch the fronts on very quickly. And they were expecting, after that brilliant qualifying when they were qualified second and third, they didn't think the race would be quite as good as that for them. They were fully expecting Leclerc at least to come through them, probably Sainz as well, but the Ferraris were nowhere. And for reasons we'll come to in a minute. And they easily had enough pace to deal with the rest. And it was only the late safety car after Oscar Piastri had already pitted that lost them a 2-3 result rather than a 2-4, and enabled Hamilton to leapfrog up onto the podium. But yes, a terrific all-round, very pleasant performance for the team. And yeah, the big test comes at the tightest circuit, the next race, which we'll see what the real value of this upgrade, most of which came in Austria, and there's a little bit more came in, and there'll be a little bit more again in Hungary, and that will give us the sort of the bookend of the sort of tracks that they will allow us to assess the value of that upgrade. But it's clearly significant.
One thing I wanted to flag specifically in what McLaren did was Lando's performance, not just the overall performance, obviously great in qualifying, great result, but a specific element of it, which Mark and I were discussing a little bit before we started recording, which was the racecraft at the restart to hold Hamilton back, because I was racking my brains to try to think if there's been a time before where where Lando has had to go properly wheel to wheel with an established mega like Lewis or like Max, and he did that with both of them in this Grand Prix. At the start, having got the jump on Max, wasn't intimidated going on that short run to turn one. Then he positioned his car really nicely through that first of all, I guess, going into Village and then the loop, and then also on the way down to Brooklands and Luffield. But the Lewis one in particular, because I thought he was a sitting duck on those tyres at the restart, and he looked so vulnerable. So just that excellent car positioning really made Lewis, literally made him go the long way around at Luffield. And again, coming through Woodcote, I thought it was done. I thought that was it. Lewis is going to sweep past, but McLaren just had that little bit more poke than the Mercedes on the run to Copse. Lando got in front and made sure that Lewis couldn't get past, and then just did an absolutely excellent job, with the exception of muscling his way past Leclerc on the grass through Curva Grande when Lando got second in the Italian Grand Prix that Ricciardo won for McLaren. I can't think of a time where he's had to really stamp his authority on a situation like this for a high stakes position. Is there any other real example?
There's not many leaping out, but I think it's often situational in that generally his skill has been in minimising time loss when inevitably losing positions. So knowing when to fight and when not to fight. And in that situation, he did a really, really good job. It's no great surprise with Norris, but it's just another tick in the box, really, isn't it, for a really outstanding driver. Mark, we should briefly talk about how the race was won, but there's no real point in that question because we know how the race was won. Max Verstappen and Red Bull were very, very quick and peerless and in a class of their own and everything, but there was a little bit of strategic intrigue in the battle for second, third and fourth. So what did you make of the Norris unhappiness with going for hards in that final stint and how that whole situation played out?
Yeah, so going into the race, it was only Mercedes that wasn't scared of the soft tyre, and it put Russell on it. And on Friday, the soft tyre nobody got good runs from it. It had a lot of deg, but the track on Friday was 47 degrees or something, and this was 25 degrees. And Mercedes based its judgment more on last year's race. It was the same compound last year. And they figured, yeah, there'll be a little bit of dig at the start and then it'll level out, which is exactly what happened. And Russell was running for ages on it. And everybody saw this, and you adapt your plans accordingly. And that's what changed for example, Red Bull going onto softs for both Verstappen and Perez, the second stops. But the McLaren, Lando was asking to go onto softs, but there was two things. There's one is that they weren't quite sure if the softs were going to be ready, because when it was going to be a VSC, it was going to be hards, and then when it became a safety car, they thought, oh well, it would be better off on softs because you'd be vulnerable on the restart. But then they thought, we haven't got them ready; they're not warmed up in time.
And that transition from VSC to safety car happened while Norris was about 2/3 of the way down the hangar straight.
Yeah,
so that's pretty close to the pit entry.
Exactly. So it was too late really to risk the change, because if they'd not been ready, then it could have all gone wrong, horribly wrong. But the other point is that they knew that the car could switch the hards on within half a lap. So as long as he could defend for that little bit of time, they would have figured he should have been all right, and that's how it turned out. But it required an awful lot of very skillful defending in the meantime, and he was brilliant at that.
A suggestion I heard from a couple of different teams this evening was that because Russell had done this really long first stint on the softs, it seemed to make people think that actually that soft was going to work. But the suggestion that I heard was that he was doing that in that management phase. So you're planning to do as long a stint as possible. So you're using the tyres differently. And as I think Ferrari sort of saw it, was that if you then put those tyres on to basically rag it to the end in an 18-lap sprint, you were going to the rears were just going to go.
Well, yeah, this is what Max was saying when upon the restart, he just gunned it, and he got 3 laps in and thought, oh, this doesn't feel very nice. And the rears were overheating. But it's not so... When you get a cool day around Silverstone, the loads aren't that great, and you can sort of bring them back. And he did. He was able to bring them back. Same with Lewis. Lewis, in attacking Lando after the restart, fried his rears as well, but you can get them back. It's not like they're not as extreme as they were a few years ago.
It's one of those things that it's almost either way. It was quite close, that decision, but that VSC to SC was so fundamentally transformative in that, because it was lap 39 was the restart, and it was lap 33 that Norris pitted on. So when it changed, that massively condensed that last stint, and because people were having trouble, I think it's actually very hard to say whether, well, all's well that ends well, that was fine, was right, because they could have gone on to softs and everyone would be saying, you idiot, you chewed your tyres and you dropped back, you knew your car wasn't great. So tricky. I quite like the pragmatism that was there, because I think they thought, we'd like to have done that, but let's not overcomplicate it and cause a panic. So that's what Andrea Stella, the team principal, said when I asked about it. So obviously you've got to take the tyres back in, do the blankets and everything. So there's a great opportunity for chaos in that. They may well have been fine, but just don't over-engineer it. And they didn't think that the coin toss between hards and softs was that fundamentally different. So good from that perspective. And obviously the strategy side for Piastri, there was nothing they could do about that. They had to pit Piastri. Russell had already stopped. So there was an undercut threat, plus Piastri's tyres were starting to go. He just plain lucked out, Piastri, but unfortunately that cost him a podium. And actually, Josh, we should talk about that, because although we've talked about Norris, I'd actually argue that Piastri was just as good. Circumstances haven't always allowed us to get too into him this year, but this was his first big weekend in terms of results. There'd been some scepticism, actually, in some quarters. Whenever we've mentioned on the race or in a podcast that he's doing a really good job, people have kind of questioned it. So does this underline just how good Piastri is?
Absolutely. He's had an exceptional weekend, but he's had plenty of exceptional moments this season as well. It's just that finally he's had the sort of car to really show that, and the circumstances to show that. You have to remember that Lando Norris had the new front wing this weekend and Piastri didn't. We believe that's maybe around a tenth of a second. McLaren weren't precisely sure, but perhaps around a tenth of a second. What was the gap in qualifying? Only just over a tenth of a second. So for Piastri to be that close is really, really impressive. It's absolute vindication and proof, I think, that McLaren, 100% made the right decision. I think you could have said that before this weekend, that they were absolutely right to hire Piastri and end the partnership with Ricciardo earlier as they did. But yeah, an exceptional weekend. He drove brilliantly in qualifying and managed the race, I thought, exceptionally well. Stuff like the race start was great. He had, I think half a look for a few seconds at Verstappen, possibly into Copse, but kind of wisely thought, I'll stick it in third. We've seen so many times a rookie will put in a great qualifying and then just head backwards on the opening lap, or their racecraft will undo a great qualifying. But that wasn't the case at all with Piastri. He was consistently good, managing his tyres, keeping the pace up. Obviously managed a safety car, restart very well. Was really good, really deserving of a podium, and that's something that Norris pointed out immediately after the race as well. He felt Piastri had done an exceptional job, doing exactly the kind of job that McLaren could have only wished Ricciardo could have done at a circuit like this. It was really, really good, and I think a great base for him to move forward from as well. Now he's kind of got that big result. Hopefully some of that skepticism will go away, but I never really got the feeling that was even a problem for Piastri. I think he knew he was doing a decent job, and this is only sort of finally kind of proof of that. But if you look back over the season so far, there's been plenty of examples. This is finally just the kind of result he deserves.
He's so impressive in his race management and the way he handles situations. I followed his entire first stint up until the pit stop on board while it was playing out. I think you'd have really liked it, Ed, because every time he was being asked a question, he was so... I think we know that Piastri's quite economical with his words and his feedback, but he's so precise and to the point. He initially wasn't 100% convinced he could hit the McLaren target lap and make that one stop work the way that McLaren wanted it to. He was reporting a little bit of unhappiness on both axles, but then a few laps later, when he was asked for another sort of balance check or tyre check, he said, actually, it's better now, like it's coming back towards me. And then he just reeled off this really impressive run, like lap time wise, and just firmly put himself in that position where he just dropped Leclerc and that chasing group behind and put himself into this really, really strong position. The command he had of how his race was playing out before the pit stop was really, really good. I don't think he put a wheel wrong in that opening stint, or even in the second stint. He didn't have to fend off Russell quite as robustly as Norris did Hamilton, but he was doing excellently. And everybody I've spoken to from McLaren, but also some other teams as well, reckon that if that race had gone on a little longer, a few more laps, then actually Piastri would have been the one trying to pass Hamilton for the podium.
He's one of those drivers who, one of their best qualities in his junior career has actually fully translated to Formula One already. His race management was always exceptional in Formula 3 and Formula 2. And so often we see that actually not always really translating to F1, especially not during the first half of a rookie year. And that's exactly what's happened for Piastri. He obviously headed into this year thinking, oh, great, I'm at McLaren, I'm at a good team, thinking, oh, I'm going to have, a pretty good car. It didn't transpire like that. But then sort of the inverse has happened, where now, after Bahrain, he didn't think he'd have he thought he'd just have a car that could occasionally pick up points. He's now probably thinking, oh, great, now I've actually got a car that can do the things that he probably thought a McLaren could do when he first signed for them. And now we're seeing exactly why Alpine and McLaren were fighting so hard for him.
And just as a small footnote, he also had a slight engine disadvantage, and he had an engine that was older in the cycle than Norris as well. So that makes that 31 thousandths difference if you take that 10th off for the front wing. I know you're kind of making up lap times there, but I think Piastri basically performed at the same level as Norris, and when you consider his inexperience. The other thing I would say is people will say, well, I've seen people on social media saying, oh, well, Ricciardo would have got this result if the car was more competitive, but this car still has the handling weirdness he was struggling with, so I see no evidence to say he wouldn't have continued to struggle. He had a horrible time at Silverstone last year, really, really struggled. So, Piastri is actually able to get the most out of this car. And even on races where he's been out-qualified by a big margin, the pace has pretty much been there, and it'll be just like one little error or one corner where it's gone away. Barcelona was a great example of that. So yeah, it's the arrival of Piastri in terms of his halo result, but this has been there all season. Really, really impressive. Well, Scott, this is becoming almost as traditional as the question we ask Mark about how the race was won. So can you explain Perez going missing in qualifying, and how much credit do you think he deserves for recovering to sixth in the race?
Are you suggesting that we're borderline at Sergio Perez sympathy corner?
He might have to get it, actually, yeah. Valtteri Bottas sort of occasionally crops up in it, but yeah, it's qualifying sympathy corner for Perez.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I mean, and we don't say that, to mock him or undermining or anything like that. It's just part of this, frankly, quite ridiculous qualifying run that Checo's on, where he just can't get through to Q3, and in this case, couldn't even get out of Q1. He was obviously. There were a couple of factors against him in this situation, in that he did queue for 8 whole minutes before at the end of the pit lane before the session resumed after that late suspension in Q1, which did have a bad impact on tyre temperatures, and I was probably sent them to absolutely nothing. And then he was the first car on track, which means when you've had that sort of light rain and the conditions are a bit difficult, even over the course of, a full grid's worth of out laps and then a full grid's worth of flying laps, you are going to get track evolution because it will be very, very quick through that process. So that did count against Perez, not going to deny that. But the car that was behind him in pit road and the car that was behind him on track, Alex Albon's Williams, spent 7 minutes at the end of the pit lane and had exactly the same set of circumstances basically as Perez, and Albon got the Williams through Q1 easily, about half a second quicker than Perez managed. So I just don't think it's an excuse. I don't think it's an acceptable excuse for not getting a Red Bull through Q1. And to Checo's credit, I mean, there was maybe like a little bit of an embellishment of, his complaints about the tyre temperatures. Red Bull sort of spun into his defence in their press release. But when I spoke to Checo after qualifying, he didn't really make that much of an excuse. He kind of just said, like, these conditions just expose a limitation he has with this car. And he talked about it again after the race, where he wasn't a massively stunning recovery. He felt quite limited in the car. He used the tyres too hard early on, and then didn't have much left to fight with, struggled to overtake. He's finding the car actually as the longer the season goes on, actually a bit trickier to really have in that window. And I think these slightly strange circumstances we've been having with some rain-hit qualifying sessions and all that, I think that's bringing the worst out of him, because he's in those fine margins where you need to then really be able to lean on the car. He's not got the confidence to do that. He's not comfortable, and the 1 lap pace just isn't there. What was more concerning for me about today is that the race pace wasn't really there. It was still a good recovery in the end. It was okay, but it felt to me like he was slower in this race than he's been in other races.
He did have a safety car misfortune as well, because he pitted before it. But there was one other thing he complained about, Ocon forcing him wide at the start. We were having a look at this earlier, weren't we, Mark? And Perez put his car in a very optimistic place. He was squeezing down a gap on the outside of the run to turn 1 that was about 3/4 the width of a Red Bull. And then, of course, he ended up off track. So I think that was him being a bit bold. I don't really think Ocon did anything wrong there, but that's just because he was eager to make up ground. But yeah, it's a horrible sequence for Perez. He must just go into a weekend thinking, can I just go in and just qualify second, finish second, not worry about the gap to Verstappen? And yeah, maybe he has suffered a little bit from trying to push himself on to be a championship challenger to Verstappen.
He's got the same number of Q3 appearances now as Alex Albon does in the Williams.
Well, that's the thing with that comparison you made about Albon. Albon was, 8/10 off pole, and there was a half a second difference or whatever between them in Q1. And that's the margin that Perez should have had. So, it's just not working for him, and it's unbelievable, the qualifying run. But again, as I always am contractually obliged to say, it does show how good Verstappen is just at execution, because having a good car and being able to get the best out of it all the time are not as simple as people tend to think they are. So it's also to Verstappen's credit. Mark, let's talk about Mercedes, because it was a mixed bag for them. The qualifying pace wasn't great, but Lewis Hamilton did come through to take third, albeit with the assistance of the safety car. George Russell was fifth, having been on the other side of that safety car coin toss. So how good was Mercedes really?
It was about, it's average for the season, I would say. It ended up about there. It's a better race car than a qualifying car usually. That was the case again today. It was, pretty good on the tyres. Two good drivers in it. Yeah, it was about par for the course, but there's nothing there to give them hope that they're really closing the gap to the front or anything like that. It's just they're in the same group. They're in that best of the rest group as they always are, and the circumstances of the layout of the track or the temperature of the track or whatever will determine their place within that pack. But it was a pretty standard weekend for them, really.
Yeah, I think it's shown that shine from the boost they got from the upgrade package has kind of turned into reality. And I don't think they ever thought it completely changed everything immediately. Knew it was going to be a long haul, but Austria and Silverstone maybe a little bit harder in some aspects than they hoped for. But a good result ultimately. Russell was a bit unlucky because he had that long first stint on softs and then could go on to mediums, but that was a little bit before the safety car. Unfortunately, got a bit annoyed with Charles Leclerc as well. So yeah, solid enough for Mercedes this weekend, but mostly Lewis Hamilton just pointing at McLaren and saying, how have they done that compared to us? That came across quite a few times. A rocket ship, he called it, over the radio. Right, Josh, you heard from Aston Martin team principal Mike Crack after the race. So what reasons are they putting up for a difficult weekend with Fernando Alonso 7th and Lance Stroll a penalised 14th?
I think they're mainly hoping that it's Circuit Pacific. I mean, that seems like a fairly reasonable explanation for what's happening. In race trim, they were probably the 6th fastest car, you'd have to say. I mean, even Alpine were sort of being held up almost by the Aston. So probably their lowest point of the year, which, I mean, shows how good their season has been. And really, it was a weekend of damage limitation, as Crack put it. And on Alonso's side of the garage, they did a solid job of damage limitation. I think they can be fairly pleased with a few points. Obviously on Lance Stroll's side of the garage was much less convincing. Some really dodgy incidents, shall we say, with Pierre Gasly. There was many run-ins with him, and this was already after some bad safety car timing on his side as well. So there were definitely some points lost there, perhaps on Stroll's side of the garage. But on Alonso's side, they did maximise it. And overall, yeah, they seem to think it was just a circuit thing more than anything.
I think Hungaroring will suit them much better. We could see almost McLaren and Aston Martin flipping positions just with those track sensitivities, much lower speed, low and medium speed components at Hungaroring, much more high speed. Here, has anyone got sympathy for Lance Stroll for that Gasly penalty? Obviously, I had the instance. I'm looking at you, Scott, because I've decided you're not looking very sympathetic, I must confess.
The penalty that you got for coming back off track and then just absolutely clattering into the side of him and breaking his car.
It was a very well executed thing. It was just enough of a tap to put Gasly out, wave goodbye, off he went.
I was amazed, considering what we've seen some cars survive over the last couple of years, and Alpines in particular.
Alpines have been indestructible.
Yeah, and that broke it. I was really surprised by that. I mean, no, I've got no sympathy for that. One thing I would like one of you to explain to me, if any of you can, is why didn't Stroll get a penalty for passing Gasly off track? Because it did look to me like Gasly did leave just enough for him to have a wheel the right side of the white line, and it did look like all four wheels were over.
Well, it's not even looking like, because you have a situation as Stowe where Stroll's lap was deleted for being...
He got a black and white warning flag.
He got a black and white warning flag. That lap time was deleted. He was off the track. So he's off the track. One of two things has happened. Either Gasly's forced him off track and Gasly gets a penalty, or Stroll has gone off track and taken advantage. I don't really understand this unless they decided that Gasly was a bit leery and pushing him wide, and they just sort of let it go. Think, well,
and give a warning to be like, look,
that ends well. But then you should warn Gasly about. So I don't think it made any sense, and I think he did, because Stroll was on the outside and he had to use a bit of extra track. So yeah,
you love track limits, Mark. What do you think?
Don't get me started.
I mean, track limits are stupid.
Yeah.
Well, I had sympathy with Pierre because he was kind of like, I'll paraphrase, but he's like, we had this fast last week where you have loads of lap times deleted and loads of time penalties because track limits are meant to be really, really strictly enforced. And he's just lost a place for it, which, as he points out, does then lead to everything that follows. And it's fine. Black and white warning flag. I don't get it.
It's very, very, very curious. And again, it just points to the thing I was saying on the previous podcast, some kind of natural track limit. If you lose a bit of traction from going there, then so be it. But yeah, it seemed very, very inconsistent. Ultimately, it was fairly inconsequential because Gasly ultimately wasn't going to score points despite that battle with Stroll, because he was
could have got the Ferraris, perhaps. They were 11th and 12th. I mean, maybe sniped a couple of points. But yeah, it was already kind of, both of their races were a bit done, weren't they? And certainly not where you thought they'd have been. I thought it was a shame for Stroll, especially because I thought he had a fairly good weekend at the Red Bull Ring, and certainly in qualifying. It looked like maybe he was, had a sniff of a bit of a momentum, but unfortunately this proved once again his form's just going to keep fluctuating. Certain weekends he's going to be close to Alonso, but many weekends, unfortunately, it's all going to go wrong, either on pace or on racecraft, as it did today.
Yeah, certainly. And frustrating in general, the track limits thing. I know I caution on consistency sometimes, but the track limits thing should be something they can be a bit more consistent on. They try to be, but this is another of those anomalies. So we're going to keep talking about this endlessly. But let's move on to Williams, Scott, because it was another fine weekend for Alex Albon, 8th place with a safety car assist for him as well. Is this Williams being great relative to expectations, or is Albon just in the form of his life?
A little bit of both. I think Albon's driving superbly. You see the way he carries himself now within the paddock. He's so relaxed. He's got so much confidence now. And I was thinking this a couple of times this weekend. I think back to how we saw him at the end of 2020 when he was in that Red Bull Nadir, and he knew he was losing the drive and nothing was really going right for him. And it's so nice to see him just enjoying himself and just really leaning on it. And he's just maturing into more and more and more of a leader for Williams. Dave Robson was incredibly complimentary of Alex's calm demeanour in qualifying. Just basically said, like, if he comes in and in that red flag and you know that you've got one shot left to save your qualifying because it hasn't quite worked out. It's been a scrappy segment until then, and you've been top 3 in practice all 3 sessions, and it looks like you're about to get eliminated in Q1. The driver could easily be flustered in that situation, and if the driver comes in flustered there, then the team panics a little bit and it all just starts to unravel. There was none of that with Albon. He was very, very calm, very, very relaxed. He knew that he had the pace. Okay, the car wasn't feeling quite as good as it was earlier, but he knew he could do it, and he went out and did it. That's amazing. I think the Williams is working better. I think this has helped prove that after bringing in that big upgrade in Canada, and then we saw it work quite well in Austria, and then here it lent on some of those improved characteristics even more. So that was really good. And the upshot is that Williams is now 7th in the championship on countback, which I think is a 6-year high. They haven't been this high in the championship since 2017. So they're reaping rewards. They're not getting these results by luck. These are merited top 10 results. And as James Vowles told me at the end of the race, if anything, they were being held up by the Aston Martin in that final stint. That Aston Martin was fighting for victory a couple of races ago. So, yeah, Williams is another team that when everything's absolutely aligned, they're a really, really impressive top 10 threat.
We should say Logan Sargent, P11. That's his career best F1 result. What do you make of his weekend, Josh?
Yeah, he thought it was his best race performance of his rookie year. Obviously, in qualifying, he was still a huge margin behind Albon. Obviously, knocked out in Q2, and his ultimate best lap was about a second slower than Albon. So clearly much work to be done for him, but he felt like in race trim, he did a good job. And looking at his race, I think that's a fairly good assessment. His race start wasn't great, and he dropped behind Yuki Tsunoda's AlphaTauri on the soft tyres. Tsunoda was really struggling, and that cost Sargent a lot of time, and that kind of compromised his race after that, so he fell just short of points. It's kind of coming back to what we said about Piastri. I think it's a bit of a contrast to him, really, because Sargent's kind of making more of those kind of rookie errors that you'd expect, losing positions at the start or kind of not stringing together the lap when it matters in qualifying. So I think still plenty of work to be done for Sargent, especially while Albon is flying so highly. But certainly an encouraging race in isolation, at least, and a decent performance.
Yeah, maybe not the ideal circuit for him, given that the deficit in the fast corners has been a bit of a struggle for him, and there's plenty of that here. But yeah, Sargent just sort of chipping away, still not quite completely cracked it, but he's just sort of inching his way towards that point. Now, Ferrari, Mark. They've made some good progress recently. Montreal was quite good. Austria was quite good. Qualifying for Silverstone was quite good. And then the race was pretty terrible with Charles Leclerc 9th and Carlos Sainz 10th. So what went so badly wrong, and how much of it is a portion to strategy? How much is it a portion to bad luck? How much to their race pace not being quite what it should have been?
Yeah, it's difficult to untangle all that because basically they were terrified of the soft tyre. They were terrified of overheating the tyre, probably thinking back to the races earlier in the season before their upgrade. And they were just way, way too conservative in how they ran their race, and were very, very slow to pick up on the fact that the tyres were fine. You could actually push them, especially the medium and the hard. And so they made conservative choices. They pitted before they needed to, fearing undercuts that were almost ghost undercut threats. They went for the hard tyre at the when you switched. They could easily have done the soft. Plus the safety car went wrong and knocked them down even further. So it was difficult. If they could rerun this whole weekend with this knowledge that, look, stop worrying about the tyres are fine, that you'll be able to lean on them as hard. I think they would have had an entirely different weekend. You could probably have been vying with McLaren rather than falling down to the lower reaches of the top 10. It's a bizarre weekend for them.
I guess maybe Charles Leclerc losing that FP2 as well didn't help.
That was one of the reasons why they claim they were so bereft of the data required to make a better informed decision, because he had the electrical problem that just took him out. So they didn't really get to do the back-to-back that they would have liked to have done on the FP2.
But it's just always Ferrari, isn't it? It seems to be that have these all over the shop weekends.
If Red Bull lose a session, but come qualifying and come race day, they'll have recovered. In most of the top teams, if you put Ferrari in that situation, it's always sort of, you feel 50-50 if it will have an impact on them. It doesn't feel sure-footed.
Yeah, not a robust team ultimately, and obviously that's just showing the scars of previous races, particularly Barcelona, where the tyres were pretty horrible over a race stint, and Sainz slipped all the way back to like 54 seconds or something off the lead by the end of that race. So yeah, a tough one for Ferrari, a weekend of learning for them, you'd hope.
Well, you mentioned rerunning the weekend as well. If you were to rerun every weekend, probably the team with the biggest gains to be had is Ferrari, which says a lot about the execution.
So Ferrari lobbying for double headers, the return of what we had a couple of times in 2020. Perhaps that's what Fred Vasseur should be going for. Good for geographical transport and narrowing the amount of freight. That's what F1's going for. So there's me making a case for Fred Vasseur's new idea. But no, not entirely serious suggestion, but it says a lot about where Ferrari is at the moment. Well, for our traditional final part of the podcast, we'll finish off with some questions from the Race Members Club. For more on the Race Members Club and the benefits of joining, head to therace.com and click on Join the Race. First up, we have a question for you, Mark, from Oscar Robledo, who says, do we still not have any idea how fast the Red Bull is in Max's hands? It looked like Max could manage the pace once he got past Lando's McLaren and wanted to canter, as demonstrated by the first lap after the safety car. Yeah,
I mean, sure, he has something in hand, usually. But it's ultimately everybody's pace is defined by the tyre temperatures usually. Here, not so much this weekend, a little bit on the soft, but here it's just one of those, you get these happy races now and again. We've had one earlier in the year as well, didn't we? Where you can push the tyre. But usually it's defined by your tyre temperature, so it's a fairly set limit, really. If you give everybody like real tyre war type tyres, the way you could just attack flat out from start to finish, I'm sure he'd lap the field.
Yeah, ominous, very much ominous pace in that car. Scott, a question for you from Tom Bannister, who says, do you think Perez can do anything to save his seat for next year? Or is it likely he'll be replaced? If so, who do you think will replace him? I would give Alex Albon another go, but Red Bull doesn't like to go back. So who do they turn to? I don't think Yuki Tsunoda is ready, so I can't see who they drafted unless they gave Daniel Ricciardo 1 year to see how Tsunoda goes against Lawson.
I think we've been asked this question a few times, and up until now, been kind of emphatically saying just there's no real threat that Perez gets replaced for next year. But I have to admit, the longer the weird qualifying form goes on, and if we see a few more Sundays like this where he's just seems a bit lost and a bit slow, then maybe Red Bull's patience will be tested, and maybe they will need to make this decision. I think there are two key factors in his favour still. One is what we've talked about quite a lot, which is it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter what the second car does because Max is just relentless at the front. He's driving so well. He's winning races without a wingman. He's going to win the championship single-handedly for Red Bull, the Constructors' Championship, that is. And no one can work out whether they're the second fastest team or not. And now we've got McLaren in the mix, apparently, as well. So there's just no threat anywhere on a single weekend or in the championship. So he gets away with it effectively. And therefore, Red Bull's not under pressure to look for an alternative. The second factor is that Red Bull doesn't really have a standout alternative, certainly not on its books at the moment, because, ideally, Daniel Ricciardo, a stunning option on paper, but what version of Daniel Ricciardo is currently working within the Red Bull at the moment? Is it the McLaren spec, Renault spec, Red Bull spec? We don't really know. And he's got the test here at Silverstone on Tuesday. He's driving in the first day of the Pirelli tyre test, which is a quote-unquote evaluation to see, what they've seen in the sim. Does it translate into reality? I don't really know how much Red Bull can glean from a test like that, but I'm sure they'll be able to reverse engineer it in their own way because of how much data they've got. So Ricciardo might be an option. Neither of the AlphaTauri drivers are an option. And I agree with what is framed in the question. I think at the moment, I think Red Bull would love to have Albon as an option. I firmly believe that if Albon was doing what he's doing in a Williams in an AlphaTauri, or if he was at Williams but on a Red Bull contract, I think Albon would be a serious contender to get that seat back, which is gloriously ironic considering he was the one that was axed to make room for Perez. And until now, Perez hasn't really given us any reason to really doubt whether he would keep or lose his seat. But that's kind of the way it goes when the form becomes not permanent, but it's a trend, isn't it? It's not just a one-off. He is now regularly underperforming.
A connected question, which I'll take from Dewey Priest, who says, from New Zealand, aka the land of Liam Lawson, he says, I'm going to put a slightly different slant to the question you guys tend to get a lot. Will Perez lose his seat? And I agree with everything you've previously said that indicates a stay with Red Bull is the most likely option for 2024. But what would it take, in your opinion, for him to lose his seat at Red Bull? What's the balancing point of keeping Max and the team happy while not sacrificing too many points with the second seat? There's a few things. You touched a bit on it there, that if Checo continues to go through this, if it gets extended for another 7-8 races, they might start to think, hang on, is he in an inescapable trough? I don't think that's going to happen, but it's possible. The other one is if there's some major catastrophic flashpoint with Max Verstappen on track, a really proper collision, and they can't calm it down. That's a possibility. Obviously, it's pretty difficult for that to happen when Perez is starting on row 7 or something. So those are the things. And then they might have to look at something, but I think it would take an enormous amount for Red Bull to change next year. Perez is under contract, and we're expecting Red Bull to be strong next year. So I think it's a pretty low bar Perez has to clear in order to stay there. He's not clearing it over the last sort of 5-6 races, but I think he will on average. But if it keeps going, you never know.
I think if he goes into next year and some of the teams are getting closer to Red Bull, it becomes much more of a liability then, because Mercedes, McLaren, Ferrari all have driver lineups. Every one of them is better than Perez. And I would have said that before Perez even joined the team. They're just a higher caliber of drivers, every one of them. So if say 3 cars can get somewhere near the Red Bull next year, suddenly, you really need Perez to be up there and offering support. And I don't think he would be able to adequately do that if there were some competitive cars.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. That's something I always look for in the second driver. But that's why I actually think for 25, he's on massively thin ice at the moment. I think he is on a trajectory that means he'll be replaced in 25 currently, and I'd be much more confident of that happening. Maybe he can turn it around, but he's there to be the solid 3/10 behind in qualifying, drive around, pick up the second place, but he's not doing that. So, yeah, difficult time for Perez. He needs just to get it under control. Josh, simple question from Gareth Jenkins. How bad a day was that for Alpine?
An exceptionally bad day in the context of McLaren's exceptionally good day. Huge points haul for McLaren, lifts them above Alpine and puts Alpine down in the championship into 6th place, a position they really shouldn't be in considering the pace of their car this year. We said already earlier in the season, they may come to regret the missed opportunities of the likes of Melbourne and Baku and other weekends. And already, we probably didn't expect to see it this early, but already they are ruining those errors, those reliability problems, those small pieces of bad luck, driver errors and all that kind of thing. And unfortunately, this was another weekend of that. It's probably on the scale of their bad weekends. It's not their worst, which says probably a lot more about their worst weekends. And I say that because I don't think there was any cataclysmic personal failure on the part of anybody at Alpine, whether it be the drivers or the teams. It was partly down to circumstances. I spoke to Otmar Safnauer after the race, and he put Esteban Ocon's failure, down to a hydraulic failure, which was from a supplier, not one of kind of Alpine's own built parts. And Pierre Gasly's incident with Stroll obviously hurt him, but even before then, as we said, at best, he was looking at 9/4/10, absolute best case scenario. So, yeah, a really tricky one for them. And going forward, you have to say, comparing those two teams, if McLaren can even have half of the pace they had this weekend, you'd have to say McLaren is the favourite to keep that one. Just adding to that feeling of underwhelmingness about Alpine in general.
Next question to you, Mark, from Sebastiano Russo, who says, I was really surprised after the safety car today that all the different tyre compounds were performing at the same level. I thought that both Mercedes were going to easily jump the McLarens on the hard tyre. Was it track specific, or does the new compound brought here have something to do with it?
Well, the compound's the same, construction's new, but I don't think that had any bearing on it. I think it was just that the different cars used the tyres in different ways, and the most suitable compound differed between the cars. Like the McLaren, as we talked about, fires its tyres up really quickly, so you're relatively safe putting that on a hard tyre. The Mercedes is pretty gentle on the rubber, so you weren't risking too much putting it on the soft. If you transposed those, each car would probably have had a problem, and the other cars somewhere in between. So I think it just, around this track at these temperatures, there wasn't all that much difference between the 3 compounds, but it was small enough that you could start tailoring each of them to the traits of your particular car.
Scott, question for you from JK, who says, having just seen such an impressive performance from him, I'd like to know what it is about Oscar Piastri's driving style that makes him so fast.
Well, I think the impressive thing about Oscar's driving style is less about the specific way he drives and the fact that he's able to adjust so quickly. And he is immensely impressive with how quickly he absorbs information himself, not just with how it gets relayed to him by the team. So he works out run to run where he's leaving time on the table and how he can sort of adjust to find that. And then when he's given more specific feedback, which might be, in the push in this braking zone a little bit harder, a bit more entry speed here, or, sacrificing a bit of entry to get a better exit there. Like, he will go out and I think the way that Andrea Stella tends to put it, he will cash that experience in. So I'm not really well placed to say whether, Oscar's a particularly, aggressive driver on the front end or something like this. I've seen the way he's driven in F3 and F2, and then the work he's done to adjust to the different F1 cars he's driven now, whether it's 2021 cars, the 22 car at the end of the test, or this one. And I found it really interesting that neither he nor the team has ever really pinned him down to a particular style. It's my favourite thing about him as a driver is that intelligence and adaptability.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that, in that one of the limitations Ricciardo had was that he struggled to adapt to the weirdness of the McLaren. Norris has been very good at dealing with the car on the knife edge, and I think Piastri's doing the same thing. And that is positive, because often when we talk about a specific driving style, that's almost a box the driver gets stuck in sometimes.
The one thing I would say is this is more an observation about the way he drives in a race. So there could be a specific way that he does like to drive when the car's right on the edge, but he's beautifully calm and controlled on a race stint. He's so precise. It's amazing.
Yeah, you don't see any of those sort of impatient little snaps just getting a bit too aggressive on the throttle, do you?
No, his steering inputs are it's so fluid the way that he's driving. He's under control entry to exit, and I think that makes him really consistent and really effective over a race stint. A great example with it being this race today. Obviously, we know that the DRS is very powerful around this track with the two straights in. It can just help you follow. But he was just doing an excellent job of staying within touch, and he wasn't overworking his tyres when he was within DRS range. It's just that's an element of his driving style that comes across really clearly in a Grand Prix.
If all of the cars were blank and somebody told you there's 3 rookies in this field, I think you could pick out 2 of them, and among those 2 would not be Piastri.
That's a very good point. Yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way. Oscar Robledo, the question now which I'll take, says, well done to Alex Albon. Are we seeing the green shoots of revival for Williams as well as McLaren? I think yes, very, very early green shoots. There's a lot to be done there, as in fact we mentioned on the last podcast. But what I think we're seeing from Williams is a team that is limited in many areas, but that's kind of making the best out of what it's got. And it hasn't always done that in recent years. There's always been, sometimes they've been getting the most out of the car trackside, but you felt technically they weren't getting the most out of it. I feel like Williams are doing about the top end of what can be expected, given their many disadvantages. To have moved up to be 7th in the championship is very impressive, considering their ceiling, and it's just all about building up that capability over the years. It's a very, very long-term thing. But I just think having this nice uptick and picking up these odd 7th, 8th places and being able to be not at the foot of the championship, I think is a very positive sign for the culture that James Vowles is trying to instill, and just getting everything working as well as they possibly can. Because whatever happens, if you get 100% out of what you've got, and you increase what you've got over time, then you will move up the grid. Josh, the final question for you from Christopher Parrott, who was in the crowd today and sent us a shot of a very good vantage point at Stowe to prove it, says, with an eye to the future and given the current state of the teams and their prospects for the rest of the season and beyond, who would you most want to be? Lando Norris, George Russell or Charles Leclerc?
Well, firstly, Stowe is a great place to sit. I think it's the best place to sit on the circuit, especially for the race. You can see Vale and Club as well if you sit in the right part of Stowe. So, But anyway, it's a great question. Probably the answers would differ greatly from race to race even. In terms of the rest of the season, I'd probably want to be in Russell's shoes. I think Mercedes, obviously right now, is the second in the Constructors' Championship. And I think they're, over the balance of the season, are probably going to have the best car and best kind of operation, but you could make arguments for any of the 3. And then in terms of the future, again, you could make arguments for literally any of them. I think all 3, I think, are in a good place, because also, especially Norris and Leclerc, I think they've kind of got the freedom or the ability to switch teams anyway in the future. All 3 of their stocks are so high that even if they're not in the right position now, they've got the ability and the stock to change their position anyway in a couple of years' time.
And I think your answer there just also shows that it's very difficult. If you had to pick one team that would usurp Red Bull at some point down the line, it's very, very hard. Yeah, you can sort of say maybe Mercedes history and everything means they're the favourites to do that, but it's not as clear. Whereas actually a few years ago, if you said who's going to usurp Mercedes, certainly sort of 1920 time, you'd have probably said, it's going to be Red Bull, isn't it, rather than
2020.
Ferrari.
rather than 1920. 1920 you would have said probably Fiat.
Very point. Duesenberg, we're going to come on strong after a few years.
Yeah, that's true, yeah.
We go down a rabbit hole there. Very, very good point there. Yes, I should have said the year in full, shouldn't I? But anyway, yeah, great set of questions. Thanks very much to everybody there. Thanks to Scott, Mark and Josh for their input. As always, head to therace.com and don't forget the hyphen. Plenty to read there. Loads of podcasts to listen to as well. We've got an IndyCar podcast, Bring Back V10s, which tells classic F1 stories. That's into its 8th season now as well. And also have a look at our YouTube channel, both for long form and short videos. Well, there's a brief gap coming up before the Hungarian Grand Prix, so stay with us on this podcast for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.